And as this chart is showing us, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can see anaerobic bacteria are colonizing that little bitty baby rumen within a few hours of life. By the time she's about a week old, that calf has almost all the anaerobic bacteria that he or she's going to need. Everything else starts coming later, but I think that's pretty cool that that starts right away. Nature wants to fill that void pretty much immediately. So that is a low oxygen environment, and that's what we need. The second thing, which maybe there's some kids in here, my girls all know what that means. Just keep eating, just keep eating. It's just a little joke. Cows have to eat, and if you want to have a stable environment within the rumen, you've got to have constant consumption of dry matter. That means that when you're going to make changes in a cow's diet, you've got to do it slowly. No roller coasters. That's me if you try to get me on a roller coaster. That's your cow if you try to change her diet up suddenly. Stable feeding means a stable rumen. I included this down here for those of you that don't know what snow is, that the rumen is very helpful for people that live in my frozen corner of the world because it's like carrying an onboard heater. I think that's pretty awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about stability further here, and I'm going to introduce a term which maybe a lot of you are familiar with. Dry matter intake is the amount of the poundage of food that a cow takes in per day, exclusive of water. You need to have a certain minimum in order to keep up with a cow's needs. That is a function of a couple different factors, which maybe this is obvious to most of you, but I remember when I had an epiphany about this, that each one of these factors have to be there. It's the intake per bite times the rate of biting times the time spent grazing. That's a lot of time. You start working out a time budget for a cow during a given day, we know for sure she's going to need to eat for about 6 hours to consume that much food. She's going to need 8 hours to chew the cud from those 6 hours of eating. And then there's these other question marks. I didn't include milking up there, because some of us are milking. We milk our dexters. How many people milk their dexters? Oh, that's good. So they are good little dairy cows. They're not quite as prone to illness as some of their higher producing counterparts, but still, you got to factor in all of those sorts of things. That means that anything that you do in the matter of feed to increase the efficiency of that process is going to have an outcome to do with her dry matter intake. So the bottom line, which you'll notice I put the important stuff at the bottom, don't let your cows run out of feed. So the third requirement is good mixing. Cows are constantly sloshing their rumen around. It's a very sophisticated series of movements that's all centrally controlled. The vagus nerve from the central nervous system does that. So it does a lot of things. Vagus means wanderer, does lots of stuff through the abdomen. That's a really important feature of a ruminant because that's her primary physical contribution to her upkeep. And she does it all the time, or at least she does if she's healthy. So we're going to have a whole section on rumination. What makes a rumen a ruminant? So there are 4 main functions of rumination, which we're talking about the contractions of the rumen. It mixes the stuff. It allows a cow to belch, which is very critically important. We'll talk about that. It helps her to make a cud, to chew it, and it delivers the digesta to the lower part of the GI tract. Now, lest I give you the impression that this is just a big mosh, it is a little bit of a mosh, but there is a surprising consistency of the overall layers in the rumen, and it's maintained on the basis of density. At the top is gas, in the middle is essentially today's hay or grass, and on the bottom are the heavier things, which would be yesterday's hay and then any grain that she might have been consuming. So the first function of mixing is a really important one. The rumen is quite muscular. It has pillars located in various components. Somewhere I've got a pointer here. I guess you guys can probably see the pillars. They're these little folds. There's at least 3 of them here. You can see one right behind the reticulum, another one behind the cranial sac, up around between the ventral sac and the dorsal sac. I don't have a picture of the actual rumen, but believe it or not, those are like little columns of connective tissue and muscle that shorten whenever a cow has a contraction. This big red arrow shows the sequence of those contractions, and the overall effect of that is to tip the whole rumen forward. That's called a primary contraction when it does that. That mixes all of the ingredients on a routine basis, redistributes all of the bacteria and the fungi and all the other goodies. Now, one of the things that also does is to tip that gas cap forward to the level of the esophagus. That allows for the gas to escape up through the cow's mouth. That is critical, because a cow is making on the order of 30 to 50 liters of gas per hour. And you start thinking about what kind of a vat that would fill. And I don't know if any of you have dealt with bloat before, but you don't have a lot of time to mess around with that. You know, if a cow cannot move air through, or it's not technically air, but gas through her esophagus at an easy pace, the clock's ticking right then and there. You come to my talk this afternoon if you want to learn more about that. So the third procedure that whole process of movement of the rumen does is it regurgitates the cud. And I've made an attempt to put this little green glob, believe it or not, is the beginning of a cud. So as the rumen tips forward, the rough, undigested material, remember it's floating to the surface of that layer, moves up into the mouth, and a cow will typically chew about 40 times, like an old cowboy with a chaw of tobacco, 20 times on each side. They're going to do that probably about 2 or 3 times for every mouthful of forage that she takes, depending on how digestible it is. Which, if you do the math on that, that apparently winds up being almost 40,000 chews per day. Yeah. So this does a couple different things. It clearly breaks down the fiber, but it also introduces lots of saliva into the rumen. That is a really important point, because ruminant saliva is chock full of bicarbonate. That's baking soda. Now we're going to talk a lot as we go on about pH changes in the rumen. The production of bicarbonate in saliva is one of the primary mechanisms that a cow has for regulating the pH of her rumen. We're going to find out later why that's so important. Maybe a lot of you know that already. But the whole process speeds up fiber breakdown. So as this process goes on, the ingested particles get smaller, they sink lower, and the overall effect of that is that this super shake, it's not quite milk yet, but it's a shake, got cell contents, fiber bits, water, fats, and microbes. That is our segue into the bugs of the rumen, because that is where all the magic happens. So there are a lot of them in here, and I like talking about rumen bugs because how many times you get to use the word quadrillion in a conversation? It seems like we ought to be able to say gazillion and even sound better, which it's almost a gazillion. It's a lot of bugs. It's not all a monolithic population either. This great big guy on your left is a protozoa, and I like that picture because it shows the relative size of that population versus bacteria. The little tiny specks everywhere would be bacteria, so they're definitely not all the same size either. And when you're talking about a 40-gallon vat, which it's a little bit smaller in a Dexter, but still, you end up with pretty much the same concentration of bacteria and fungi and protozoa and some weird bugs called archaea, or a member of the archaea. But it isn't a static population. That who's who list is changing all the time depending on what a cow is eating. I'll let you read the list. There's bacteria and microbes for every purpose in the rumen. And it will adjust to what you're feeding her eventually. But I want to introduce a key point here, that it seems like it'd be nice if you could switch both directions rapidly. But the reality is that it's a heck of a lot easier to drop a cow's pH than it is to raise it. And if you've ever dealt with grain overload, you'll know what that looks like. And I think it comes down to the generation time for the individual bacteria. But I draw your attention to the center row there, the starch and sugar digesting bacteria. They only take a half an hour to double their population under the right circumstances. That means the odds are not in your cow's favor if she gets into a big glut of grain. So that's another one where you've got to work fast if something like that happens. You can come back from it. I've seen you can ask me later about shop vacs and holes in the sides of cows and some crazy adventures along those lines. But they can come back, but it is an emergency situation. So acidity matters. And I guess the big point that I want to make from this slide is that every bacterial or microbial population in the rumen has a sweet spot. And we know in general that over 50% of a cow's dry matter per day is comprised of fiber. It makes sense to us as managers of our cows' diets to try to maximize their conditions or to improve their conditions in the rumen to make it so that that happens easily. We want to make it easy on those bacteria, and you need to stay, pretty much in that sweet zone between, probably about 6.8, 6.2, somewhere in there, because you don't want to go to that low side. It's not a good situation. So that brings us down to talking about forage quality and fermentation products. There are two major ones. And that brings up a good question of asking, why do we feed cows forages? We've talked about this a little bit in the introduction. But I think it's important that sometimes we tend to overemphasize protein a little bit. Protein's important, don't get me wrong, but an average lactating cow probably only needs really somewhere around 6 to 10% crude protein. Her energy requirements are enormous compared to that. And so we should look at forage in general as being a cost-effective way to get energy into a cow, particularly because of just how abundant it is. Cellulose is the most abundant biomolecule on the planet. That's one of the things that makes ruminants so cool, especially because they're the only ones that can digest it, along with what I call wannabe ruminants. I do like horses, don't get me wrong, but they're not quite a cow. So the big point where microbes come into this is that energy in the form of volatile fatty acids, that's a new term maybe for some of you, that's the end stage product of microbial fermentation of fiber. We're going to talk a lot about that. This little picture, which you can probably hardly see, kind of just illustrates that you have this ultrastructure of the plant cell, and it breaks down. If you can see those tiny little green dots, those are actually very easily digested starch molecules. So bacteria do a good job on them. So I'm going to introduce another idea here, which again, some of this is probably very familiar to a lot of you. And that's the distinction between cell contents and cell wall. Plant cells in general are differentiated from animal cells on the basis of this cell wall, this big green thing on the outside. It's stiff, it's fibrous, it's protective to the cell, to the plant, and it allows them to stand up straight and do what plants do. It's also where cellulose and all the other fiber is located. When you look at cell contents, which are all these little bits and pieces floating around inside the cell, you're talking about essentially a 100% digestible source of energy and protein. There's sugars, there's starches, there's a little bit of fat, but mostly you're talking about the protein that's present in a forage is going to be in there. So you need to gain access to that somehow. We'll talk more about fiber quality later on that point. But the first step is that fungi will actually attach to the outside of the cell. They secrete enzymes. They will literally start driving their arms and legs down into the cell wall to bust holes. And that's why, in case any of you are wondering why I have a piñata up here, believe it or not, that's supposed to make you think about a cell. So you can't get to the goodies inside until you bust the exterior. Oh, everybody's cool. So the cell wall ruptures, bacteria go to work, they colonize the interior of the cell. They do have some effect on the exterior too. But the bottom line process that bacteria are important for is the fermentation of fiber to volatile fatty acids. If they were not there to do that, your cow's rumen would not work. And so that is a quite extensive process. This chart isn't meant to overwhelm anybody. It's just meant to show kind of how stuff moves. That at the top of that is all of the overall starches and carbohydrates that are present in that forage mixture. And as it breaks down, you end up siphoning things off. And the end product is either digestible starches and carbohydrates that will go right into the lower part of the GI tract for the cow to absorb, or they're going to be used by the bacteria to drive their overall metabolism. And that was my point earlier, that the volatile fatty acids are actually a waste product from the bacterial fermentation. So volatile fatty acids are not a monolithic population either. What you feed a cow can drive the percentages of each of these categories. There are some other ones. The 95% feature backed up there is just talking about the fact there's some other minor ones. But on a diet of hay, in general, good quality forage is going to give you a bias towards acetic acid. That's good because that's where fat comes from. If a cow is deficient in the production of acetate or acetic acid in her rumen, she's going to have depression of fat in her milk. She's going to have changes in her body fat composition. And so, especially if anybody is a Weston A. Price fan, that's an important feature. It also has to do with the overall health of the rumen because that's not a super strong acid. And I'm not going to go into strong acids and weak acids, but that's good if you're going to try to keep your pH stable. Propionic acid is important because that's the primary source of glucose for a cow. Propionate goes straight to the liver and gets converted through the Krebs cycle and is used as energy. So that's a good thing to have, and forages will give you that to some extent. But that's definitely where your grain and some of your other energy-dense concentrates can sometimes be helpful, is that you're going to be biased towards these other two, the propionic acid and butyric acid. I put a picture of that rumen lining there just to kind of point out that volatile fatty acids also have an impact on the growth and the development of the little fingers on the inside of the rumen, the papillae. And butyrate in particular gets converted very quickly to ketone bodies, which are used as energy right there in the rumen lining. That's one of the reasons why cattle that are on exclusively a forage-based diet, especially poor quality forage, you might see pictures on the internet of where they'll have little short rumen papillae. And so it's a balancing act. And that gets back to my point about straw back at the beginning. There is some protein production in the rumen. There's a lot of protein production in the rumen. That's the other nifty secret to a cow's success, is that she can consume a relatively poor quality protein source, or maybe even not very much protein, or maybe other forms of nitrogen that aren't even protein, and the bacterial population doesn't care. It will take that protein, it will assimilate it for their own needs, and it will build bodies. They're kind of heroic. They do all this work, and then they just throw themselves into the volcano. Sorry. So we need to feed the microbes. That is the bottom line point here, is that, and some of us maybe on mornings after we've chased a cow into the milk stanchion, or we've been dealing with somebody not so cooperative, we might not think of cows as being particularly cooperative, but that is what they do, is cooperate with their rumen microbes. And this is a good place to introduce another concept, and that is of fiber quality. We've talked about this kind of peripherally a little bit, but this is a very important thing, that you can have hay or pasture that looks great on paper, but if it's a sparse stand of grass, or if there are things growing in that pasture that inhibit a cow from eating it, or if you notice that they need hay at 8 o'clock in the morning, you should have done it last night, but you go to work anyway, it does you no good. You've got to get it into the cow, and she's got to eat it happily in order for things to run really good. Because animal performance is related to dry matter intake. I'm not going to go through that equation again because we've already talked about it. I talk about it a lot because it's pretty important. So the amount of energy that a cow can extract from a forage is directly related to the types of fiber present. That is a key point, and it'll help you. If you get that, you'll understand better fiber analysis and forage analysis in general. And that is very closely related to maturity. The younger a plant is, the less fibrous, or at least the less stiff her fiber is. That means that it's more digestible. The older a plant gets, we all know this, it gets stiffer and taller. That's how you get these big, cool aerial structures and get your seed heads up high. And think about a corn plant, how tall some of these things get. It's pretty crazy. So the three major categories are cellulose. We talked about that. It's the first thing produced, which that's up in the diagram here are these kind of golden colored French fry looking things. I think they look like rebar in a cement wall. I think that's a decent analogy. And as time goes on, you're adding reinforcement to that structure. So you build a rebar structure, maybe you add some fiberglass underlayment. I don't know much about cement, but that's kind of how hemicellulose works. It's sort of like it adds tensile strength to the overall cell. But the last to form, which is bad news to digestibility, is lignin, because it creates these covalent linkages between various molecules, and it ties up cellulose, ties up protein. It's not a good thing to a cow, because lignin is not digestible at all. Really it's just a bad thing to have in excessive levels. So this goes on to explain that a little bit further, and this kind of breaks down. Some of you guys might be more text sort of people. If anybody wants copies of this presentation, by the way, my email address is at the end. And I think they were talking about posting it to a website somewhere too, but if you don't want to have to read the whole thing. But this kind of points out how there's different digestibility of different fiber sources. The one that I really want to draw your attention to would be where it talks about hemicellulose and cellulose. That's important for grasses in particular. Some of the older nutrient analyses are based more on a legume digestibility model. And some of the values like the relative feed value, relative feed quality, sometimes they tend to bias against grass just because of the hemicellulose. Hemicellulose is an awesome thing to give to your cows. That's actually more digestible in most cases than cellulose, as long as it's not tied up to lignin. There's an old analogy in ruminant nutrition about a skyscraper demolition. I think it's a good one. It's been used for a lot of years. The basic point is back to our equation again, is that dry matter intake is the intake per bite times the rate of biting times the time spent grazing. Some of those things you have little control over. If a cow is eating something that's really, really dense, so you're tearing down a building with lots of rebar, and if you really reinforce cement, really dense structures, it's simply going to take longer. And the key point here is that rate limitation equals appetite limitation. And that's going to have an effect on a lot of different things. And quality of the fiber dictates the quantity she can eat. So the last thing I want to put into this category is a little bit about fiber length. Again, with so many things with cattle, it's an issue of balance. You don't want to go too far one way or another. You might think, well, why don't we just feed our cow alfalfa pellets and do nothing else? Why is that a bad idea? It's right here. The rumen contractions are controlled by the vagus nerve, but there's a trigger. And that trigger is what we call the scratch factor. You need to have a certain percentage of the fiber that a cow eats be at least 2 inches long so that you can stimulate the lining of the rumen adequately to get a good quality contraction. The other thing that is really important for is that it drives saliva production. The more fibrous and stemmy a mouthful of food is, the more saliva a cow needs to rinse it down. And that's really important for maintaining rumen pH. So the important point there is that you don't want to graze too short of a grass, so don't go out there too early. At least not if you're not going to supplement it with some other form of fiber. And don't chop your hay too finely if you chop it. And don't just feed alfalfa pellets. So we're going to go really quickly through hay and forage analysis. This is a subject that you could teach a whole course on, let alone an hour, let alone 2 minutes. But there again, we can kind of come back to it if anybody has questions. This is just an expansion of what we were talking about earlier, that I think the big thing I'd like it if you guys could keep in mind, that will help you understand this, is that basic division between cell contents and cell wall. If you can set that aside and say, okay, cell contents 98% digestible, that has a big impact on how you make hay, by the way. I don't know if does anybody make hay here? A lot of people make hay? Some of us. So you probably know that you don't want hay to sit in a field for 2 weeks with rain every third day, and then you're going out and you're turning it, and you're asking yourself, yeah, not by choice. I understand that, but that is going to have an impact on the cell contents, because as long as a forage is wet, it is going to be losing these components through fermentation and just leaching. That also has to do with hay storage. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The cell wall, though, we discussed those 3 fiber sources, and hopefully it's clear to everybody that digestibility varies with maturity. There are a couple terms that I want to introduce here, which again, if anybody does any hay analysis, they probably are familiar with these. Back in the 60s, there was a guy named Van Soest that went through and figured out a way to fractionate out cell contents versus cell wall. And that's still the system that's basically used now. There's a few modifications of it. But really, there's 2 main categories. The neutral detergent fiber is pretty much all of the cell wall. So that's cellulose, lignin, hemicellulose. So that's a good way to assess just how much fiber is there. The other number that goes along with it is called the acid detergent fiber, which that's a second step after they add the neutral detergent. And what that does is it gets rid of the hemicellulose. So then you have a new number that tells you just lignin and cellulose. So, I mean, the basic point that I'd like for you guys to get out of that, if you're not familiar with these numbers, is that the higher ADF is compared to NDF, the more mature a forage tends to be. You see, I got my letters cut off there. I apologize for that. The other terms that some of you might be familiar with, which we're not going to go into a ton, it's mostly applicable to beef cattle, would be the idea of total digestible nutrients. That's a calculation. It's mostly based off of the acid detergent fiber. But there's numbers within the nutrient recommendations for beef cattle that you want to, they're targets. You want to try to hit that at a certain stage of gestation or a certain stage of lactation, you want a given level of total digestible nutrients. And that's very much related to the acid detergent fiber. Crude protein is the other thing you can look at, just because, again, if there's protein present in a forage, it's because of cell contents. And so if you have a way of assessing that, that's also a little bit of an indicator of the quality of that forage. So this, I guess I just talked about that. The other number that you might see on analysis that's pretty important to notice, mostly because it allows you to compare evenly across various types of hays, is the dry matter percentage. You need to know what you're starting with after water is taken out. As-fed basis is interesting, but it's not necessarily going to give you an adequate comparison, especially if you're buying hay, which for a lot of us, that's the reality, and it's expensive. So we'll talk more about kind of the bottom line points on these things. So I just wanted to kind of go through that. So here's the nitty-gritty. So the lower NDF and ADF are, compared to your total digestible nutrients and your crude protein, the more immature and easily digestible forage is. If you're not going to look at anything else on an analysis sheet, you should look at those numbers. Crude protein is certainly an important component of that, and I don't, like I said earlier, we overemphasize protein, but you should look at that, just because that's going to give you an idea as to what you're starting with and maybe where you're going to have to supplement, depending on what your goals are for that forage. There's a couple ratios here, a couple scenarios that I just kind of want to touch on. I don't want to confuse anybody here. But if you have too much fiber and not enough protein, bacteria don't care. They do care, but they switch gears a little. They will switch to a much less efficient digestion system, and you'll slow down fermentation. If you go the opposite direction and throw out too much protein and skimp on their good quality fiber, they go the other way. They get impatient. They'll actually start using protein as an energy source. That is tremendously expensive and tremendously inefficient. And it has an impact on their health as well. If you've ever heard about water belly in steers, that's one place where that comes from. There's too much protein in their diet. They end up dumping it into their other body fluids. So whether that's blood urea nitrogen, milk urea nitrogen, that all factors in there. The biggest thing that I want to get across, though, is that you're never going to be able to supplement protein in general as efficiently as feeding high-quality forage. Good hay is always going to pay you to feed that. In my part of the country, we see a lot of byproduct feeding. We have it pretty readily accessible corn distillers grains, beet pulp, a little bit of canola cake. I've been managing disasters from those feeding systems for most of my career. It can be done, it is possible, but if you're looking for stability in your cow, I can't say it. I understand why economics sometimes dictate doing that, but I'm sorry, there is no replacement for good hay in a cow, in my opinion. Because if the rumen bugs ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Cows need those microorganisms to convert feed components into usable sources of energy and protein. And the consistency is the major point that I keep on harping on here. So what's that? That's a big picture. And that's what I want to talk about. What are we trying to come back to here in practical terms? We need to slow down and look at our cows. I like this quote because it's very true, both in my professional life and my personal. You miss more by not looking than by not knowing. And I'll be the first to admit that, I'm sorry guys, men are not as good at this. And I find it ironic that we call it animal husbandry. Did I get an amen? I've been married for 14 years, and I think I'm getting better. But Heather is definitely the part of our operation that keeps this going. And I see our girls going the same way. And that's something to encourage you guys too that have kids, is get your kids involved in this. Get them out there and talk about what you're seeing. Because I think a lot of this gets to be second nature in most of our minds. If you have cattle long, most of this is not rocket science. In fact, it's not rocket science at all. But it is important. And unless you talk about those things with your kids, you're not going to be able to build that same level of concern for any element of animal husbandry, least of all feeding. Because there's all kinds of areas where this comes down to being careful observation being the key. I won't go through all of those because you know that. But here are some things that you can look at. You probably already know that owning cows and then being excited about it makes you a little bit weird in some people's eyes. This area in particular will give some raised eyebrows. Because somebody comes over and they just want to see your cute little cows. And you spend your entire time looking down. You're saying, oh, Lena's got a little sloppier today. I wonder what's going on with Tildy over there. Please tell me you all do this.
Yes.
This can be somewhat quantified. I like this website. Noble.org is a good resource looking at manure scoring. There's been attempts to correlate changes in overall herd stool consistency to problems. And you got to be careful with this, because certainly changing water content in your cow's diet suddenly is going to have an impact here without meaning anything. So you don't want to overinterpret stool. But I like this just because it's sort of a daily way to check in. Just say, what's going on? But bottom line, I mean, this is probably clear by now, but over here on you guys' right-hand side, that's drier stool. You don't want stool that looks like that on a routine basis. That's going to be probably a little bit less digestible fiber, maybe a little less water than they need. Maybe you're not feeding enough protein. In the middle is about right. On the left would be in situations where you could probably be going the opposite direction, or maybe you're feeding a little too much grain, or maybe not enough fiber. One key point in the middle there is if you see really loose, watery stool with grain present, that's a little bit of a red flag, at least in my mind, because that tells me that stuff is shooting through the rumen without being processed. Corn is a little bit different in that regard. There's some studies at NDSU from years ago that was showing how it's not completely true that seeing it is a problem. But there again, you got to look at your cows. You got to see what's their intake, are they excited about eating, etc. And that's the second area that you need to get used to looking at. Is back to my first point, happy cows are eating all the time. 8 hours per day, minimum. Every time you go out there, you should be seeing a certain percentage of your cows chewing their cud. And take some time when you're getting used to this to look. Are they chewing 20 times per side? It's another place where you'll seem a little odd to people. Neighbors, I can see them through the binoculars. I would encourage some of you, if you've never listened to a rumen or felt a rumen, do it sometime. It's pretty cool. It's a key indicator of a cow's health on a day-to-day basis. If you can do it safely, get yourself a stethoscope, or even just put your hand on there. Left-hand side, that's my cow Tildy. So right behind her rib cage, you should be able to put your hand, and about maybe one time a minute, certainly no longer than every 3 minutes, you ought to feel something that reminds you of thunder in the distance coming closer to you. It's a crescendo, decrescendo. And you might get kind of addicted to checking that. The bottom line is that slack sides and empty rumens are trouble. Now, a good thing to get in the habit of doing, which I'm not saying you've got to get in this religious thing where once a month you do this. I think it's a good tool, though. If any of you don't know how to body condition score, take time to learn this. It's not hard. Because if nothing else, you're going to be able to look through your group and see, I don't like where this is going. Now keep in mind, this is always a little behind the times. It's going to take you probably a minimum of a month to change a body condition score on a cow, especially if you're trying to raise it. But a lot of times there are factors that might be beyond your control, whether it's weather or some other issue that's happening. But I guess the way I promote body condition scoring is a way to check up on your day-to-day observations. And if you really want to find out where you're at, because I think all of us tend to bias a little bit for our cows, usually thinking they're proper condition and they're over-conditioned in my case. But have somebody else score your cows. Find somebody else that knows what they're doing. Just invite them over and say, have a quick look. You can stare at the manure and they can score your cows. I say analyze your hay. I don't mean test your hay. I think it's good to test your hay. You should do it every once in a while. If for no other reason, it'll give you a feel for what some of this stuff means. But I think we need to sometimes step back and think about the forages from the cow's perspective. Try to put ourselves in their shoes a little bit. Does the hay smell good? That's a simple test. Is there mold there? Is it green? Are there thorns and there woody bits? You need to try to get a little handle in your head for what stage was that hay baled at. Remember my point about maturity and fiber digestibility. It truly does matter. And if you're buying hay and somebody's trying to get you to spend 50, 60, 80, 120 higher, I don't know where it's at in your part of the country. It's kind of crazy some places. I think it's prudent to ask some hard questions. You don't have to be mean about it, but any good hay seller is going to be willing to talk to you about that. In fact, they're probably going to be excited. Of course, they might be not as excited when you offer them less because of what you know about it. But the point is, you need to get a little handle for that and find out how is it stored. Are any of you able to store all your hay under cover? Oh, that's good. Sometimes I don't hear that from people. The reality is a lot of us can't, and that's a lot of expense. You've got a building tied up for a long time of the year. In my neck of the woods, we're looking at probably a good solid 6 months sometimes of hay feeding. So I realize that there's some practicality issues, but you lose a lot. You're leaching dollar bills into the soil when you just lay them on the ground underneath a tree. Soil contact is what robs hay of their nutrients. They can handle a little bit of water, but you can't have it sitting on the ground, at least not if you're going to store it for any length of time. There's been lots of studies done. 2 to 3 months, you're going to lose probably 35% of the overall nutrients in that bale. So asking those kinds of questions is a good idea. Sometimes the super steal of a deal on hay is not so much of a deal. And I guess if you're going to do that, that's where getting an analysis is definitely helpful. Assess your pastures. So I think most of us agree that's a pretty nice looking pasture. To me, I see 3 things there. I see water, I see sugar, I see protein. I might be wrong. I mean, I need to go out there and grab a handful and look at it. I was talking with our next speaker about bricks there a little bit earlier. I think those sorts of factors come in here. But the reality is that if you start seeing your daily observations and your monthly body condition checks, and maybe if you're milking your cows, you're going to see some drop in milk production. You're going, what's the deal here? This is a beautiful pasture. What's missing from this picture? Can anybody tell me? Fiber. So what can you do to fix that? Take that nasty bale that you overpaid for last fall, and then you left it outside all winter so it doesn't have any more protein in it, and put it out there. You'll be amazed the cows will eat that. I don't know if you've ever done that before, but we do that all the time, and especially in our neck of the woods where we end up we're converting a farm that basically was all just no-till soy and corn. We're dealing with annuals right now. In early stage annuals, and you're going to deal with some fiber problems sometimes if you're out there too early. You need to match your supplements to your forage resources. That lush pasture probably doesn't need a protein supplement, but you might need a fiber supplement. I think you should always supplement trace minerals. Our next speaker can talk a lot about that, because that is critical. I also think that it's easy to get involved in an awful lot of hype there. There's a lot of dollar bills associated with that subject. So you need to do your research. Find somebody that you trust that you can talk to. Because there are plenty of feed dealers that are happy to explain to you why you ought to have their mineral. The question of concentrates and grains is not clear-cut. Depends. A lot of factors. We feed we're mostly grass-fed at our place. We like grass. It's a heck of a lot cheaper than buying other stuff. But I'm not opposed to using some grain when you need it. And there again, your daily observations, your monthly observations are going to help you there. But a key point here is that you can't, in my opinion, ever supplement your way out of bad hay. You can probably improve fiber digestibility with a little extra protein. There's some studies out of Iowa State that was looking at some pretty deficient diets. They're looking at some pretty terrible pasture and terrible hay quality. I think they were running about 3 to 5% crude protein. But they watched the body condition. Those cows did fine. They all carried their calves. These are beef cows. So it's not impossible. It's not that I'm disagreeing with the nutrient requirements of cattle that says you got to have 6 to 8%. But the reality is the bacteria can have a tremendous amplification effect on the nitrogen that you have access to. You need to look at the rumen. You need to look at the cow. And you need to keep asking questions. So this is my last slide, and that's my little Reuben on the zip line. That was the last slide before it was too cold to do it anymore. So you need to educate yourself. I'm glad we can have talks like this. You should keep going to talks like this, especially with people smarter than I am. And you should get books. Don't be overwhelmed by the prospect of learning these things. It's not that hard, especially when you correlate it back to what you already do and you know on a day-to-day basis. Find some mentors. And keep in mind that what works 1 month for one cow might not work the next. And what works on my farm might not work on yours. That's part of what makes farming so cool, is that it's highly individualized. That's also what makes fibers and fiber analysis and forage analysis in general pretty cool, is that it's not like a concentrate. You can't use book values for this sort of thing. My wife is a cheesemaker, and I think it's a lot similar in cases like that there's an art to all of this, that it's very hard to just put down in terms of hard and fast rules. And this is the story of my life anymore, because I've been practicing 11 years, and in some ways I feel like I'm just starting. I'm pretty young yet. I hope I'm going to get smarter in some of these areas. But education is the process of moving from cocksure ignorance to thoughtful uncertainty. That's probably the biggest thing that I'd like all of you to take from this, is to keep an open mind, look at your cows, and I'm happy to chat with anybody further anytime. That's my email address. And I have a few minutes for questions. In the front row.
You're talking about analyzing your hay. Where's the best place to go to get that analyzed?
So a question about hay analysis, that's a good one. I think I put that in here somewhere. There are a lot of accredited labs. Right there. I just breezed right over it. The National Forage Testing Association is a great resource. They talk about how to test your hay. They give a list of good probes. There's all kinds of them out there. Good place for education is that website, foragetesting.org. We personally, I don't think it's wrong to mention any names here, we use Dairyland Labs ourselves. We've had good luck with them. But there's lots of groups around the country. One of the key points with picking a lab is that you should find out if you get your sample back. Because if you don't like your results, or if you want to run some test somewhere else, you don't want to start over with a fresh sample. One of the things you'll learn when you're testing hay is that your analysis is only as good as your selection of samples. So, and there's scientifically valid ways of going through a winter supply of hay and taken from the right place in the bale and the right number of bales. You can get kind of caught up in that, but I don't have any specific preference, so long as they are listed as being accredited by the National Forage Testing Association. Anyone else? In the back.
What are your thoughts on haylage or a silage?
So, haylage and silage, about their use. I think that I love them. I think that they're fantastic feeds. The biggest thing, if anybody that's not familiar with that, that's the process of basically pre-starting rumination. You're breaking down some of the fiber in that product prior to it getting to the cow. So it's kind of a gimme for the rumen. You're delivering a volatile fatty acid profile into that rumen, and you're giving them a fiber source that's already broken down a little bit. And obviously, some of those types of feeds are the cornerstone of the dairy industry, because it's sometimes very hard in a really heavily producing dairy cow. It's hard to keep up with that with just hay alone. It's not impossible, but you got to be really finicky about your hay. I think the biggest limitation on that, for small producers especially, is the cost of the equipment. Because it's significant. To get out there, if you're going to be making baleage and bags, you've got a certain amount of machines that you're going to need to have access to. There's also the issue of quantity, and maybe this isn't so much of an issue down here where it seems to be very hot. But up where I'm from, if you have too small of a pile, it's going to freeze. And the same rules that I put out for a cow's rumen in terms of fermentation, that all applies to a haylage stack or a silage pile too. In terms of the anaerobic conditions, the stable temperature and pH, and adequate mixing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Over here.
Ben, talk a few minutes about distillers grain, because in this part of the country we have a lot of distillers grain in our feed. And why will some of our dexters eat it, and some of our dexters will simply turn their nose up at it?
So distillers grains are something that we have a lot of in our part of the world too. There's a lot of ethanol production in North Dakota. If you live next to a plant, you can get it reasonably priced a lot of times. So for anybody that doesn't know, distillers grains are a byproduct of corn ethanol manufacture. It's what's left after the carbohydrates are essentially removed from that corn plant. There's a few other fractions that come off, but I think that the issue with corn distillers, it's a good protein source, and that's really what it's fed for, is protein. The problem is what comes along with it. There are issues of mycotoxins. I think that's, because this isn't just a dexter problem, this is true in general. I think where a lot of people get around it in the commercial world is with TMRs. you grind something up small enough and mix it with enough other things, and cows don't have much of any other alternative but to eat it, for better or for worse. Mycotoxins are something that would follow the corn plant from its storage, which I always, whenever I see they're setting up one of these great big huge outdoor storage things for corn on my way down here, I thought, mycotoxins! Because you get the right conditions, and they'll grow and they'll proliferate, and they can have some really big issues on cattle. So I think that's a concern. You have to think about that. I'd be pretty cautious. That's the same with beet pulp. I'm really careful. We were talking about GMOs earlier. I think reproduction can have a conflict. I dealt with a train wreck in a bull seed stock producer where he had a huge epidemic of testicular degeneration. And we were dropping probably about 1 centimeter a week in some of those bulls. And that was his livelihood. And we did some testing, and we ended up finding some zearalenone and some other estrogen-like products in those bull systems. I can't prove it was the distillers or the pulp, but I guess that was enough for me to make me a little bit nervous about a lot of byproduct feeds, especially when it comes to a place where it really matters. Like, you might be able to get away with a lot when you're talking about a finishing steer. I guess it just depends on what you're after with it. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of lick tubs have distillers' grains in it. So if you're trying to avoid that for any reason, you want to read your labels. I'm not against it, and you'll probably see it. Back to my thing, what works for me might not work for you. And it depends a lot on the plant. The other thing to keep in mind is that if the plant is older, you may have some significant sulfur in that stuff. They use a sulfuric acid rinse in that process, and I've seen some polio in cases like that. So, yes?
When we were feeding the distillers, getting back to the cow patties there,
Yeah.
there's a definite metallic look to it. What is that caused by? You have any clue?
The question was about a metallic sheen on the stool, like almost like an oil slick, would you say?
Yeah.
I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of fat present, to be honest with you. That's something we didn't talk about in this presentation. Fat can be utilized in the rumen up to an extent. You got to be about 5% or less on basis of dry matter, else you'll have gumming up the works too bad. And there again, depending on the plant, you might end up with a little bit of basically corn oil present in that final product. There's some of the more modern techniques end up fractionating that off, but or at least they would have by the time it got to that point. They're making corn oil and whatever else. But I have seen that too. I think that's where it comes from. Yes.
So distillers grain from grain alcohol plant making liquors and so forth. So is that, you follow the same guidelines there? It's a higher moisture content, like 70% of moisture.
Oh, as far as I think your question had to do with how do you assess the crude protein level in that?
Well, do you look at it the same way as you would a distiller's grain for ethanol?
Oh, in general, but are you talking about the like steep liquor and those sorts of products, or
Yeah, like
wheat middlings and that?
Beer and everything.
Sure. I think you just have to dig in a little. Anytime they're selling a feed source, they're going to have a guaranteed analysis with that. And I think that's probably where I would start, or at least I would ask for it. They may not be, depending on what they're charging, they may or may not be willing to just hand that out to you.
give it away.
Yeah. So, but you should be able to find somebody there that can give you at least a handle, because that's part of their systems, is to figure out what's coming off here and there. They should be able to give you an idea of your crude protein, at least, and your dry matter, or your moisture content. If you know that it's 70%, you can start with that. That's a lot of water to haul. I think that's a big limiter up in our neck of the woods too, especially with pulp. But yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to any of those ingredients, but I think when you start digging into those sorts of supplements, especially if they're free and easy to you, that's back to consulting some professionals. Because another case, I dealt with a really terrible case. I've never seen a calf had a heart attack before. But this guy called me up, my calf had a heart attack. Sure enough, he had probably, I think he lost 11 or 12 calves that day. He just keeled over. Like, what in the world? Well, he'd been feeding straw, beet pulp, and distiller's grains. And guess what? There's no selenium in that. I've seen mulberry heart disease in pigs before, but never in calves. So I mean, that's not that's an extreme example, but my point is that if you're going to start going into that, you need to get a little bit deeper into it in terms of plugging in some numbers into a ration software or something. They're available for free. You can educate yourself to do that. It's not that hard. Sometimes extension agents are good resources for that too. But I would have, to give you a direct answer to that question, I would have to see what the actual component analysis was on that feed. I'd be careful. Anybody else?
I actually have a question. Now, it's really common for people to store their hay on the ground. I thought you would just lose, that bottom 20, maybe 30% at most. But does it really leach all the protein throughout the entire bale into the ground?
Yeah.
Or is it just that bottom layer that gets nasty?
I'm glad you brought that up because it defies reason a little bit. So the question was, do you lose nutrition from the whole bale when it's sitting on the ground, or is it just the bottom part? Incredibly, if it's within 2 to 3 months, it's the whole bale.
Wow.
I mean, if you go online, there's lots of people talking about this, and it's very well studied because people, when you're busy that time of year, you want to just go plop it in the yard and be done with it. I understand that. But simply getting, I think one of the studies I saw that was most interesting is it doesn't have to be expensive. You can go find yourself a bunch of old tires. If you lay down tires, put your hay on top of it, and put a tarp over, you'll drop that 30-35% number down to about 8 to 10%.
Right.
So it does pull from the whole bale, though.
It does.
And it's actually worse when you stack it. And I'm not sure I even have a handle on that. I think a lot of it just has to do with creating sort of this overall leach from the system. It's like a big wick.
So we buy, just get like old pallets, not old, but they're still put together, and we just lay them on the ground and put our bales on top of that.
Do you cover them?
Well, we did last year, but we haven't yet this year.
Yeah, I would cover them, because that was one thing that if you get, pallets are fine. If you can get them off the ground so that you break that contact. In fact, even a layer of gravel will cut a lot of that contact.
So we covered it last year, but we noticed there was some condensation that would build up under the tarp and basically rain down on the bales. Is that...
Yeah, you're going to have some of that, and there's no doubt, like if you look at the spread of nutrient loss, covering bales on some kind of elevation is not as good as putting it in a building. I mean, ideally you want to have airflow. And I guess the other thing that I was going to point out there is that you've got to make sure you have adequately cured hay. That's where maybe, have you guys ever run any analyses on any of your hay? Or?
Yeah, we buy hay from a hay guy, and he runs analysis on all of his batches. So,
do you know your moisture percentage on average?
I can show it to you afterwards.
We can talk about it later.
He texted it to me.
Because I wonder if you weren't getting some greenhouse effect there too, where the humidity is rising because the heat's beating down on it. And
well, we live in Oklahoma, so it's constantly humid in the summertime. Do you know what I mean? It's like 120%.
So that could be the root of your trouble right there.
Yeah. So in our case, would it be better to not cover it, just keep it elevated?
I think the research would say you need to cover it.
Okay.
I think that's probably the time I've got, unless anybody has a real quick question. Otherwise, I can sure chat later. I'll be here most of the day. I appreciate you all having me. Hopefully this was useful.